Hello there, and welcome back to Sleep Science Time. It's truly lovely to have you here. Thank you for choosing this particular moment to pause, to let the day's noise settle into something quieter, something more peaceful. Tonight, we're venturing into rather unusual territory. We're going to explore one of humanity's oldest and most profound questions. What happens when we die? It's the sort of question that's been whispered in every language, pondered by every culture, and yet somehow remains beautifully, frustratingly unanswered. We'll be looking at what science actually knows about death and dying, examining the curious phenomenon of near-death experiences, and then, because we're only human after all, indulging in a bit of philosophical speculation about what might come after. There's so much to gently unpack here, from the measurable, observable moments when our bodies shut down, through the strange accounts of people who've glimpsed something beyond, right up to the timeless questions about consciousness, spirit, and whether there's anything more waiting for us. And somehow, despite the rather weighty subject matter, I'm hoping you'll drift off feeling oddly comforted rather than existentially troubled. That would be ideal, wouldn't it? Before we begin, I'm genuinely curious. What are your actual thoughts on this subject? Perhaps you're lying awake at 3 a.m. pondering mortality, or after losing someone and questioning what it all means. Or maybe you're just here because the topic intrigued you and you thought, well, might as well contemplate the nature of existence whilst trying to fall asleep. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm glad you're here. Leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me what draws you to this question. It's also a close subject to me, and there's something rather profound about knowing we're all pondering this together, scattered across the world, united by our curiosity about the one certainty we all share. And if these gentle wanderings through life's biggest mysteries appeal to you, a like and a subscription would mean the world. It helps this little corner of the internet find others who enjoy falling asleep to discussions about consciousness and what might lie beyond. For those of you who've been here before, thank you. Knowing you return to these quiet moments is genuinely heartwarming. Now, this is a relaxed exploration, not a lecture. I'm not here to tell you what to believe about death or the afterlife. That's deeply personal territory. We'll look at the science where it exists, acknowledge the mysteries where it doesn't, and treat the whole subject with the respect and wonder it deserves. And yes, sleep is absolutely encouraged. If you drift off halfway through, I'll consider that a job well done. Right then, I think we're ready to begin our journey into one of life's and death's greatest mysteries. If you need a drink or to put on your pajamas, then go and do that now before we start. I'll still be here when you return, hopefully. Right, let's start with what we actually know. And I do mean actually know, with science and measurements and doctors nodding seriously whilst checking monitors. Because before we venture into the mysterious and speculative bits, and we will, I promise, it's worth understanding what physically happens when a person dies. Death, it turns out, isn't quite the single moment we often imagine. It's more of a process, a cascade of events that unfolds over minutes, sometimes hours. Your heart stops beating, but you're not immediately entirely dead. Different parts of you shut down at different rates, like lights going out in a building, room by room. The medical definition of death has actually changed over the years, which is rather unsettling when you think about it. For most of history, death meant your heart stopped beating and you stopped breathing. Simple enough. But then we invented CPR and defibrillators and ventilators, and suddenly people whose hearts had stopped could be brought back. So was that death, or just a bit of a pause? These days, doctors recognize clinical death, when your heart stops and breathing ceases, and biological death when your cells begin to die and the damage becomes irreversible. The gap between these two is where medical intervention happens, where paramedics and emergency doctors work frantically to pull people back from the edge. So what actually happens in those moments? Let's walk through it. When your heart stops, blood stops flowing to your brain. Your brain, that remarkably demanding organ consuming about 20% of your body's oxygen, despite being only 2% of your body weight, is suddenly starving. Within about 10 seconds, you lose consciousness. Your brain simply doesn't have the oxygen to maintain awareness. It's rather like a computer losing power. The screen just goes dark. After about 20 to 40 seconds, your brain waves flatten. The electrical activity that defines consciousness, that constant chatter of neurons firing, begins to fade. This is detectable on an EEG machine. Those squiggly lines doctors examine with furrowed brows go quiet. Within 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen, brain cells start dying. The damage begins in the most oxygen-sensitive regions first, particularly the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus. This is why timing is crucial during resuscitation. Get someone's heart beating again within those first few minutes, and they might recover completely. Wait longer, and even if you restart their heart, they may have suffered irreversible brain damage. But here's something fascinating. Even after your heart stops and your brain waves flatten, things are still happening. Your cells don't die immediately. For hours after clinical death, individual cells throughout your body are still alive, still functioning in their small, oblivious way. Your hair and nails continue growing for a bit. Well, not really growing, but appearing to, because your skin is retracting. Your digestive system keeps working on whatever your last meal was, which is a somewhat undignified detail, but there we are. Different tissues have different tolerances for oxygen deprivation. Your brain is fragile, dying within minutes. Your kidneys and liver last a bit longer, up to an hour or so. Your skin cells can survive for several hours. Bone and connective tissue can remain viable for more than a day. This is why organ donation has different time windows depending on which organs are being harvested. Rather grim, but medically important. There's also a brief surge of brain activity that happens right at the edge of death. Studies in rats, yes, we've put dying rats in EEG machines. Science is nothing if not thorough. Showed a burst of coordinated electrical activity across the brain in the 30 seconds after the heart stopped. A final flare of neural fireworks before the lights go out entirely. Whether this happens in humans, we're not entirely sure. It's rather difficult to study, for obvious ethical reasons. You can't exactly wire up dying patients and wait for the moment. But some scientists believe this surge might explain some aspects of near-death experiences, that sensation of heightened awareness people report. We'll come back to that shortly. What about the famous life flashing before your eyes? There might be something to that, neurologically speaking. When your brain is starving for oxygen, it starts firing somewhat randomly. Memories might activate, not in chronological order, but in bursts of association. Your dying brain, desperately trying to make sense of what's happening, might rifle through your memory banks like someone frantically searching through files. The experience of time can also distort dramatically when your brain is compromised. Seconds might feel like minutes. A brief neural event could subjectively last much longer. This is why some people who've been resuscitated report elaborate experiences during what was, objectively, just a minute or two of clinical death. Now, what about the moment itself? What does it feel like to die? Obviously, the people who could tell us definitively aren't available for interviews, but we do have accounts from people who've come very close and from medical professionals who've been present at countless deaths. Many describe a sense of peace, of letting go. The body seems to have mechanisms that make the process less distressing than you might imagine. Your brain releases endorphins, natural painkillers. There's often a sense of detachment, of observing rather than experiencing. It's thought to be your brain's way of protecting you from trauma, even at the very end. Some people remain conscious right up until the final moments, lucid and aware, sometimes choosing their last words with surprising care. Others drift in and out, their consciousness flickering like a candle in the wind, and some slip away quietly, seemingly unaware that anything significant is happening. There's no single experience of dying, just as there's no single experience of living. What happens to you during all this? That sense of self, that internal narrator commenting on your experiences, where does it go when the brain shuts down? That's where science gets a bit fuzzy and philosophy takes over, because consciousness, that subjective experience of being you, is the greatest mystery in neuroscience. We can measure brain activity all day long, but we can't quite explain why brain activity feels like something from the inside. Is consciousness just what it feels like to be a functioning brain? Does it end when the brain ends? Or is it somehow separate, something that might persist after the biological machinery stops working? Science, for all its tools and methods, hasn't definitively answered that question, which is where things get interesting, isn't it? Before we move on to the really curious stuff, I should mention that none of this is meant to be frightening. Death is natural, universal, inevitable. Understanding the process doesn't make it less significant. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. Your body, even as it's shutting down, is following patterns refined over millions of years of evolution. There's a strange dignity in that. And here's something worth considering. Of all the things that will happen in your life, death is the one absolute certainty. You might never climb Everest or write a novel or learn to juggle, but you will definitely die. It's the one experience every human who's ever lived has shared or will share. Rather democratizing when you think about it. Right then, that's the biology sorted. Your brain shuts down, your cells gradually die, and the machinery of life grinds to a halt. But that's just the physical story. Because for thousands of years, people have reported something else happening at the moment of death, something that doesn't quite fit the purely biological narrative. Strange experiences, encounters, sensations that seem to transcend the mere switching off of a brain. Shall we have a look at those? Right, near-death experiences, NDEs if you're feeling acronym friendly. These are the accounts that really make scientists uncomfortable at dinner parties because they're remarkably consistent across cultures and yet utterly bizarre by any conventional understanding of how brains work. The term was coined in 1975 by psychiatrist Raymond Moody in his book Life After Life, though the experiences themselves are ancient. Medieval texts describe them, Ancient Egyptian writings mention them. They appear in religious texts across cultures. But Moody was the first to systematically collect these accounts and notice the patterns. And the patterns are striking. People who've been clinically dead and then resuscitated often describe similar experiences regardless of their cultural background, religious beliefs, or expectations. It's this consistency that makes NDEs so intriguing and so difficult to dismiss as mere hallucinations. So what do people report? Let's walk through the common elements, shall we? First, there's often an out-of-body experience. People describe floating above their body, watching the resuscitation efforts from above. They report seeing the medical team working on them, sometimes recounting specific details about who said what or where instruments were placed. Now you might think, well, they were conscious and simply remember what happened. Except these accounts come from people who are clinically dead, with no measurable brain activity, no heartbeat, sometimes with their eyes taped shut during surgery. There are documented cases of people accurately describing events that happened while they were flatlined. One famous case involved a woman named Pam Reynolds, who underwent brain surgery in 1991. Her body was cooled, her heart stopped, her brain waves flat. She was, by all measurable criteria, dead. Yet afterwards she described conversations between doctors, specific surgical instruments used, even the song playing in the operating room. Her neurosurgeon, not typically the type to believe in the paranormal, admitted her account was accurate and deeply puzzling. Then there's the tunnel, a dark passage with the light at the end. It's so common it's become a cliché, the subject of jokes and cartoons. But people genuinely report this sensation of moving through a dark space toward brightness. Some describe it as peaceful, others as propulsive, like being pulled towards something. The light itself is often described as warm, loving, all-encompassing, not painful to look at despite being brilliantly bright. Some people describe it as having a presence, as though the light itself is conscious and welcoming. It's the sort of description that sounds absurd in the retelling, but seems utterly convincing to those who experienced it. Many people encountered deceased relatives, a grandmother who died years ago, a friend from childhood, sometimes even relatives they didn't know had died. There are cases of people meeting, during their NDE, a family member whose death they hadn't yet been informed of. These encounters are typically brief, often taking the form of reassurance. It's not your time yet, or you need to go back. There's frequently a life review, a panoramic playback of your entire existence. Not just the major events, but trivial moments you'd forgotten entirely. Some describe it as non-judgmental, simply observing your life from a removed perspective. Others report understanding, suddenly and completely, the consequences of their actions, how they affected others, the ripple effects of everything they'd ever done. It's often described as more emotionally intense than the actual events were when they occurred. People report encountering a barrier or boundary, a point they somehow know they cannot cross and return. A river, a fence, a line of light. The form varies, but the sense is consistent. Beyond this point is permanent, no coming back. And then there's the knowledge. Many people describe receiving information during their NDE, understanding cosmic truths or the nature of reality or their life's purpose. Frustratingly, this knowledge often becomes fuzzy or impossible to articulate once they're revived. They retain the certainty that they understood everything, but the details slip away like dreams upon waking. Terribly inconvenient for those of us hoping for definitive answers, isn't it? Throughout all of this, people consistently report that time felt different. What objectively lasted seconds felt like hours, or time seemed meaningless entirely, as though past, present, and future were somehow simultaneous. Linear time, that reliable structure organizing daily life, apparently doesn't apply in near-death states. And here's the thing that really challenges the purely biological explanation. Many people report that their NDE was more real than ordinary reality. Not dreamlike or hazy, but hyper-real, more vivid and concrete than everyday consciousness. This is the opposite of what you'd expect from a dying, oxygen-starved brain. Hallucinations from oxygen deprivation are typically confused and fragmentary. NDEs are often crystalline and coherent. So what do scientists make of all this? Well, they've proposed several theories, none of which quite explain everything. The oxygen deprivation theory suggests that lack of oxygen causes hallucinations. When your brain is starving, it misfires, creating false perceptions. This might explain the tunnel vision, your visual cortex losing peripheral vision first, creating the sense of moving through a tunnel. But it doesn't explain the consistency of experiences, the accurate perception of verifiable events, or why oxygen-deprived brains would produce similar hallucinations across different cultures. The DMT theory is more exotic. DMT is a powerful psychedelic compound, and some researchers believe the brain releases it at death. Rick Strassman, a psychiatrist who conducted DMT research, suggested this might explain NDEs. People who've taken DMT report similar experiences, out-of-body sensations, encounters with entities, a sense of accessing other dimensions. But we don't actually know if the brain releases DMT at death. It's an intriguing hypothesis, but unproven. Temporal lobe seizures can produce out-of-body experiences and a sense of presence. Stimulating certain parts of the temporal lobe can make people feel they're floating above themselves, or that someone else is in the room. Perhaps dying brains undergo similar temporal lobe activity. But again, this doesn't explain the verifiable observations people make while clinically dead. Some researchers point to the brain's attempt to create a coherent narrative from fragmentary dying neural activity. Your brain is hardwired to make sense of things, to construct meaning from chaos. Perhaps NDEs are the brain's final attempt at storytelling, weaving random neural firings into a comprehensible experience. It's a tidy explanation, except for those pesky cases where people accurately describe events they couldn't possibly have perceived. Then there's the survival hypothesis, the idea that consciousness can exist independently of the brain, at least temporarily. This is the most controversial explanation in neuroscience circles because it challenges the materialist assumption that consciousness is purely a product of brain activity. If consciousness can persist when the brain isn't functioning, that rather changes our understanding of everything. Most neuroscientists are deeply uncomfortable with this idea. The brain, they argue, produces consciousness the way a generator produces electricity. Turn off the generator and the electricity stops. But some researchers, like Sam Parnia, who's conducted extensive studies on cardiac arrest, suggest we shouldn't dismiss the survival hypothesis just because it's uncomfortable. The evidence, however unusual, deserves investigation. Here's what makes this genuinely difficult. We're trying to study subjective experiences that occur when the brain isn't functioning normally. We can't replicate NDEs in a lab for ethical reasons. We can't put someone through clinical death repeatedly to study their experiences. And we can't easily verify whether what people report actually happened in any objective sense. Studies have tried. Hospital rooms have been set up with images visible only from the ceiling, hoping someone having an out-of-body experience might see them. Results have been inconclusive. Some people report floating up but don't see the images. Some see things from odd angles. It's messy, as most real-world research is. What we do know is that NDEs profoundly affect people. They typically lose their fear of death. They often report feeling more compassionate, more interested in others, less concerned with material success. Their values shift. For something that's supposedly just a dying brain's hallucination, that's a remarkably consistent and long-lasting psychological impact. Studies show that around 10 to 20% of people who've been resuscitated from cardiac arrest report NDEs. That's millions of people worldwide. They can't all be lying or deluded. Something is happening, even if we don't fully understand what. And here's a curious detail. Children have NDEs too, often before they're old enough to have cultural expectations about death or afterlives. Their accounts are simpler, less elaborate, but follow similar patterns. They describe going somewhere peaceful, meeting people, feeling loved. They don't have the vocabulary or cultural framework to be copying anything. They're just reporting what they experienced. There are also cultural variations, which is interesting. Westerners often report meeting Jesus or angels. Hindus might encounter Yamaraj, the Lord of Death. The tunnel is common across cultures, but what's at the end varies based on religious background. This suggests cultural expectations shape some aspects of the experience, but not the fundamental structure of it. So where does that leave us? With something genuinely mysterious, honestly. Science hasn't definitively explained NDEs. The materialist theories don't account for all the evidence. The survival hypothesis is uncomfortable for most scientists, but can't be entirely dismissed. We're left with uncertainty, which is rather fitting for a topic involving death and consciousness. Perhaps the most honest answer is, we don't know. People have these experiences. They're remarkably consistent in structure. They're deeply meaningful to those who have them. And they suggest, though don't prove, that something of consciousness might persist beyond clinical death, at least briefly. Whether that something is just the last gasps of a dying brain or genuine evidence of consciousness existing independently, well, that depends partly on what you're willing to consider possible. Science deals with the measurable, the repeatable, the material. But consciousness itself, that subjective sense of being you, has always been slippery and hard to pin down. Which brings us rather neatly to the next question. What is consciousness anyway, and where does it come from? Because if we're going to speculate about whether it continues after death, we should probably figure out what it is first. Shall we have a go at that particular puzzle? Right, consciousness. The thing you're experiencing right now as you listen to this. That sense of being you, of experiencing your life from inside your own head. It's so fundamental, so immediate, that we rarely stop to think about how utterly strange it is. You are, at this moment, aware. You're hearing words, perhaps feeling the weight of blankets, maybe noticing the room's temperature or sounds from outside. More than that, you know you're experiencing these things. There's something it's like to be you, a subjective quality to your existence. Philosophers call this qualia, the intrinsic feel of experiences, and we have absolutely no idea how this happens. I'm serious. For all our neuroscience, all our brain scans and neural mapping and understanding of synapses and neurotransmitters, we cannot explain why any of this feels like anything. We can track which neurons fire when you see red, or hear music, or feel pain. We can map the neural correlates of consciousness with impressive precision. But we can't explain the jump from neural activity to subjective experience. This is called the hard problem of consciousness, termed by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995. The easy problems, well, easy is relative, they're still tremendously difficult, involve explaining how the brain processes information, integrates sensory data, controls behavior. These are mechanistic questions, challenging, but in principle solvable through standard neuroscience. The hard problem is, why does any of this feel like something? Why isn't the brain just processing information unconsciously, the way a computer does? Why is there an inner experience, a subjective point of view? What makes the difference between a philosophical zombie, a hypothetical being that acts exactly like a conscious person, but has no inner experience, and an actually conscious person? We genuinely don't know, and this matters for our question about life after death, because if we don't understand how consciousness arises from matter, we can't confidently say what happens to it when that matter stops functioning. The mainstream neuroscience view is that consciousness is what it feels like to be a functioning brain. It emerges from the complex interactions of billions of neurons, the way temperature emerges from the movement of molecules, or liquidity emerges from the behavior of water molecules. It's an emergent property, something that arises from complexity but isn't present in the individual components. By this view, consciousness is entirely dependent on the brain. Damage your brain, and your consciousness changes. Anesthetize your brain, and consciousness disappears. When the brain dies, consciousness ends. Simple, materialist, and deeply unsettling if you were hoping for something more. But there are problems with this view, which is why some scientists and philosophers remain skeptical. First, there's the binding problem. Your brain processes different aspects of experience in different regions. Color in one area, movement in another, sound somewhere else entirely. Yet you experience a unified, coherent reality. How does the brain bind all these separate processes into one seamless experience? Where does the integration happen? We don't really know. Then there's the question of why consciousness exists at all. From an evolutionary perspective, why would subjective experience be necessary? Couldn't evolution have produced highly sophisticated unconscious information processors? Why add the element of felt experience? What survival advantage does it confer? The answers are speculative at best. Some researchers point to integrated information theory, proposed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. This suggests consciousness arises when a system integrates information in a particular way, creating something called phi, a measure of how much integrated information the system contains. The more integrated information, the more conscious the system. By this theory, consciousness is a fundamental property of certain kinds of information processing. It's an elegant theory, mathematically sophisticated, and it makes testable predictions. But it also has strange implications. If consciousness is about integrated information, then potentially any system with sufficient integration could be conscious. Your smartphone might have a tiny amount of consciousness. The internet might be conscious. consciousness becomes a spectrum rather than an on-off switch. Others propose quantum consciousness theories. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff suggested consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules within neurons. Quantum mechanics, with its observer effects and non-local correlations, might explain some of consciousness's strange properties. It's tremendously controversial, dismissed by many neuroscientists as pseudoscience, yet it refuses to disappear entirely because it addresses questions other theories don't. The quantum approach is intriguing because quantum mechanics already deals with the role of observation and consciousness in collapsing wave functions. In quantum theory, particles exist in superposition, multiple states simultaneously, until observed, at which point they collapse into a definite state. Does this mean consciousness plays a fundamental role in reality itself? It's a rabbit hole that quickly gets rather deep and strange. Then there's panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, like mass or charge. Not that rocks are conscious in any meaningful way, but that they possess proto-consciousness, basic subjective experience. Combine enough of these basic elements in the right configuration, and you get human-level consciousness. It sounds absurd, but some serious philosophers take it seriously because it solves certain problems about how consciousness could emerge from non-conscious matter. If matter was never truly non-conscious, there's no emergence problem. Now, what does all this philosophical meandering have to do with death and possible afterlife? Everything, actually, because if consciousness is merely an emergent property of brain activity, then it ends when the brain ends. Full stop. No afterlife, no survival, no continuation. You're your brain, and when it dies, you die entirely. But if consciousness is something more fundamental, something that uses the brain but isn't identical to it, then death becomes more ambiguous. Perhaps consciousness can exist independently, at least temporarily or partially. Perhaps the brain is more like a radio receiver than a generator. Consciousness exists independently, and the brain tunes into it rather than creating it. Turn off the radio, and the broadcast continues. The radio analogy is imperfect, of course. Damage specific parts of the brain, and specific aspects of consciousness change. You lose language, or memory, or personality traits. That suggests the brain is doing more than just receiving consciousness. But perhaps it's filtering and shaping consciousness, determining what form it takes while embodied, without being its sole source. We're deep in speculation now, which is rather the point. Science hasn't solved consciousness. We can't even agree on what kind of problem it is. And until we understand what consciousness is and how it relates to matter, we can't definitively say what happens to it at death. What we can say is this: consciousness, whatever it is the most intimate aspect of your existence. It's the only thing you directly experience. Everything else, the external world, other people, even your own body, you know only through consciousness, and yet it remains profoundly mysterious. When you die, something stops. The question is, does consciousness stop entirely, or does something of it persist, transform, continue in some form we don't yet understand? Does the subjective sense of being you simply cease, like a candle blown out, or does it transition into something else, some other state of existence? Science can't answer that, not yet, perhaps not ever. Because consciousness, by its nature, is subjective. We can't observe it from outside, We can only experience it from within, and the dead, frustratingly, aren't available for interviews about their current state of consciousness. Which leaves us in interesting territory, doesn't it? We have the physical facts about death. Neurons stop firing, the body shuts down. We have the puzzling reports from NDEs, experiences that shouldn't happen when the brain isn't functioning, and we have the deep mystery of consciousness itself, what it is, where it comes from, whether it can exist independently of matter. None of this proves an afterlife, but it does leave the question open. Science deals with the measurable and material, but consciousness, though apparently dependent on material brains, has properties that seem to resist purely material explanation. It's the crack in the materialist edifice, the one phenomenon that consistently refuses to be fully explained in physical terms. So when we ask whether consciousness survives death, we're asking a question that sits right at the boundary of what science can address, and perhaps that's appropriate. Death, after all, is the ultimate boundary, the final frontier between the known and the unknown. We've covered the biology, examined the near-death experiences, and wrestled with consciousness. Now, shall we venture into pure speculation? Because while science can take us this far, the questions people actually care about, what happens after, where we go, whether we'll see our loved ones, requires us to step beyond what's measurable into what's possible. Let's explore some possibilities, shall we? Right, okay, here's where we leave the solid ground of peer-reviewed studies and venture into the realm of what if. I want to be clear about this. What follows is speculation, philosophy, hope, and curiosity rather than established science. We're exploring possibilities, not certainties. But these are the questions people actually lie awake thinking about, aren't they? Not the neurochemistry of dying, but what might come next. Let's start with the concept of a soul or spirit, something that exists beyond your physical body. Nearly every human culture in history has held some version of this belief. The ancient Egyptians believed in the Ka and Ba, spiritual components that survived death. Hindus and Buddhists speak of Atman, an eternal self that reincarnates. Christianity and Islam describe souls judged and sent to eternal destinations. Indigenous cultures worldwide describe spirits that journey after death. The universality is striking. Different details certainly, but the core idea that you are more than just your body, that something essential persists, appears across vastly different cultures that developed independently. Does this universality mean something? Is it humanity grasping at a fundamental truth, or is it wishful thinking, the desperate hope that death isn't the end? Perhaps both. The desire for survival doesn't make survival false, but it does mean we should be cautious about assuming it's true simply because we want it to be. So what might a soul or spirit actually be? If consciousness is somehow fundamental, as some theories suggest, perhaps your essential self, your memories, personality, subjective experience, exists as a pattern of information or energy that can persist independently of the physical brain. Not a ghostly duplicate of your body floating around, but something more abstract, a configuration of consciousness itself. Some quantum theories propose that consciousness might involve non-local quantum effects, phenomena that aren't bound by classical physics restrictions. If consciousness operates partly in the quantum realm, perhaps aspects of it don't entirely depend on the physical brain's continued functioning. It's tremendously speculative, bordering on fantasy, but it's not entirely outside the bounds of theoretical physics. Or perhaps the soul is less like a thing and more like a process. Your consciousness, while alive, is a dynamic pattern constantly changing, processing information, experiencing and reacting. Maybe what continues after death isn't a static copy of you, but a continuation of that pattern, now freed from the constraints and limitations of a physical body. What would that feel like? Here's where we really enter speculation. Many spiritual traditions describe the afterlife as a state of consciousness rather than a place. Not heaven as a physical location with clouds and harps, but heaven as a state of being, of awareness, of connection. You might not have a body in any physical sense, but you'd still have subjective experience, still be aware, still be you in some fundamental way. Some describe it as existing in pure consciousness, aware and present but no longer confined to a single point of view. You might experience a sense of expanded awareness, of being connected to everything, of understanding truths that were hidden while embodied. That sensation people report in NDEs, of suddenly understanding everything, might be just a glimpse of what consciousness is like when it's not filtered through a physical brain's limitations. Would you still be you? That's the question that troubles people most. If consciousness continues but changes fundamentally, are you preserved or lost? Perhaps it's both. Perhaps the essential pattern that makes you you persists, but without the filters and constraints of personality shaped by biology and experience, you'd be simultaneously yourself and something more. Think of it like this. Right now, your consciousness is focused through the narrow lens of your body and brain. You experience one moment at a time, one location, one perspective. Perhaps after death that lens widens. You're still you, still contain all your memories and essence, but you're no longer constrained to that single focal point. You're the same person having a vastly expanded experience. Or perhaps, as many traditions suggest, we transition through stages. The immediate after-death experience might be bewildering, your consciousness still thinking it needs a body, still attached to earthly concerns. Gradually you'd adjust, realize your new state, and move into whatever comes next. Like learning to exist in a new dimension, it would take time to adapt. What about the afterlife itself? What might it actually look like? Or rather, what might it be like, since looking implies eyes and physical senses you might not have? The traditional Western conception is heaven and hell, eternal reward or punishment. But many find this unsatisfying. Is your entire eternal fate decided by a few decades of earthly life? Does a just universe really condemn people to infinite suffering for finite mistakes? It seems disproportionate, doesn't it? Other traditions offer more nuanced possibilities. Reincarnation suggests you return to physical life, perhaps many times, gradually learning and evolving. The life you just lived influences the next one, but you get repeated chances to grow and develop. You're not trapped in one eternal state, but cycling through experiences, each one teaching something. Or perhaps there are multiple levels or dimensions of existence, and after death you move to one appropriate for your spiritual development. Not punishment or reward exactly, but natural progression. Like graduating from school, you don't stay in kindergarten forever, nor do you skip straight to university. You move through stages, each one suited to your level of understanding. Some Eastern philosophies suggest ultimate reality as a state of unity, where individual consciousness dissolves back into universal consciousness. You don't cease to exist, but you stop existing as a separate self. You merge with everything, experiencing reality from all perspectives simultaneously, no longer bound by the illusion of separation. It's simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, depending on how attached you are to being distinctly yourself. Then there's the possibility of something entirely beyond human conception. Perhaps what comes after death is so foreign to embodied experience that we literally can't imagine it, any more than a fish can imagine flying, or a person born blind can truly imagine colour. We're trying to describe a dimension of existence we've never directly experienced using concepts and language shaped by physical reality. Maybe the afterlife isn't one thing. Maybe different people experience different afterlife states based on their beliefs, expectations, or spiritual development. Your consciousness creates its own reality after death, shaped by what you believe and who you are. This would explain why different cultures report different afterlife experiences. They're not contradictory, just different regions of a vast possibility space. What about the nature of time in an afterlife? Time, as we experience it, seems intimately connected to physical change, to entropy, to the ticking of clocks and rotation of planets. Without a body, without physical processes, would time exist? Many spiritual traditions describe the afterlife as eternal, but not in the sense of lasting forever. Rather, as existing outside time entirely. Past, present, and future might be simultaneous or meaningless. You might experience a single eternal now, infinitely deep, containing everything. And here's something comforting to consider. Perhaps the afterlife is fundamentally about connection rather than isolation. Most descriptions from various traditions emphasize reunion with loved ones, a sense of belonging to something larger, of being part of a cosmic community. Perhaps death doesn't isolate you but connects you more deeply to everything and everyone. The energy conservation idea is rather compelling, actually. In physics, energy is never created or destroyed, only transformed. Your body's energy doesn't disappear at death. It transfers to the environment as heat, chemical energy in decomposition, eventually cycling back into the ecosystem. But what about the energy of consciousness? If consciousness has any physical basis, its energy must go somewhere. Perhaps it transforms into some other form we can't yet measure or detect. Of course, consciousness might not be energy in any physical sense. It might be information, pattern, organization rather than energy. And information, according to some physicists, is as fundamental to reality as energy and matter. Maybe consciousness as information persists in some realm we don't yet understand, a dimension where information itself has existence independent of physical substrate. We're rather deep in speculation now, combining physics, philosophy, spirituality, and hope into something that's neither science nor pure fantasy but somewhere in between. It's the best we can do with the ultimate question, isn't it? Death is the one experience we can't study directly, can't repeat, can't observe from outside. But here's what we can say. Consciousness exists. You exist right now, experiencing these words, thinking your thoughts, feeling your feelings. That's not speculation. It's the one absolutely certain thing. And if consciousness exists, if subjective experience is real, then the universe is stranger and more profound than pure materialism suggests. Whether that strangeness includes some form of afterlife we can't prove, but we can't disprove it either. The question remains genuinely open, poised between possibility and uncertainty. And perhaps that openness is appropriate. Perhaps we're not meant to know for certain, not yet. Perhaps the mystery itself serves a purpose, making this life more precious precisely because we don't know what, if anything, comes next. Right, one more chapter to go. The question people ask most when contemplating death. What about the people we've lost? Our parents, grandparents, friends, children, partners, those who've already made that journey. Are they somehow still present? Can they perceive us? Will we meet them again? Let's explore that, shall we? This is the question that truly matters to most people, isn't it? Not the philosophical abstractions about consciousness or the mechanics of dying, but the deeply personal question: what happened to them? Your grandmother who passed last year, your friend who died too young, your parent, your child, your partner. Where are they now? Can they see you? Do they know you're thinking of them? These aren't idle curiosities. They're questions carved from grief and love, the desperate hope that death isn't quite as final as it seems. And while science can't provide definitive answers, there are experiences people have, phenomena reported across cultures and centuries, that suggest, though don't prove, that our loved ones might remain present in ways we don't fully understand. Let's start with something many people experience but rarely discuss: sensing the presence of someone who's died. You're alone in a room, and suddenly you feel them there. Not threatening, not frightening, just present. You might smell their perfume or aftershave, hear their laugh, feel a familiar touch on your shoulder. These experiences are remarkably common, reported by anywhere from 30 to 60% of bereaved people, depending on which study you consult. The scientific explanation is straightforward. Grief hallucinations. Your brain, missing someone intensely, creates false sensory experiences. It's your mind's way of processing loss, providing comfort when you need it most. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly materialist, and yet it doesn't quite capture the quality of these experiences for those who have them. Because people don't typically report these as dreamlike or hazy. They describe them as vivid, immediate, more real than imagination. And they often happen when the person isn't actively thinking about their loved one, sometimes years after the death when grief has mellowed into gentle remembrance. The timing seems odd for a grief-induced hallucination. There are also what researchers call crisis apparitions, experiences where someone perceives a loved one at the moment of that person's death, sometimes without knowing the death had occurred. You wake suddenly, certain your mother was in the room, only to receive a phone call minutes later informing you she's just died. Or you're driving and clearly see your friend in the passenger seat, looking at you sadly, and later learn they died in an accident at precisely that moment. These are harder to dismiss as grief hallucinations because they happen before the person knows there's anything to grieve. Coincidence? Possibly. The human brain is excellent at finding patterns and meaning in random events, but the frequency of these reports, documented across cultures and throughout history, at least raises questions. Then there are deathbed visions. People who are dying often report seeing deceased loved ones in the room with them, sometimes days or hours before death, sometimes in their final moments. They'll suddenly become alert, look toward a corner of the room, and speak to someone invisible to everyone else. "Mum's here, they might say, smiling peacefully. "Dad's come to get me." Medical staff who work with dying patients report this happening regularly. The patients aren't typically delirious or heavily medicated when it occurs. They're lucid, calm, often more peaceful after the vision than before. They describe their deceased relatives as present and real, there to guide them through the transition. One could argue this is the brain's final comfort mechanism, a hallucination designed to ease the fear of dying. Evolution might have selected for this trait because it made the dying process less traumatic, but that explanation, while tidy, requires assuming that evolution programmed us to hallucinate specifically deceased relatives rather than, say, comforting abstract imagery. It's possible, but it feels somewhat like explaining away rather than explaining. There's also the phenomenon of shared death experiences, where someone present with a dying person reports experiencing aspects of their death. They might feel themselves leaving their body alongside the dying person, perceive deceased relatives coming to collect them, even glimpse what seems like an afterlife realm. These aren't the dying person's experiences being reported second-hand, they're experiences had by healthy living people in the room. Dr. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience, has collected numerous accounts of shared death experiences. They're less well known than NDEs, but equally puzzling. If these are hallucinations, they're somehow shared hallucinations. Multiple people having remarkably similar experiences simultaneously. Group suggestion? Mass delusion? Perhaps, but it's a curious phenomenon regardless. What about signs? Many bereaved people report receiving signs from their deceased loved ones, a particular song playing at meaningful moments, lights flickering, objects associated with the person appearing in unlikely places, dreams that feel different from ordinary dreams, more vivid and meaningful, where the deceased person delivers a message or simply appears healthy and happy. Skeptics rightly point out that humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We notice coincidences that confirm our beliefs and ignore those that don't. A song comes on the radio, and if it reminds you of someone who died, you interpret it as a sign. But that song plays dozens of times daily for millions of people. Sometimes timing will feel meaningful purely by chance. Fair enough. But for those experiencing these signs, the feeling of connection, of being reassured that their loved one continues somehow, somewhere, provides genuine comfort. Even if they're self-created meanings imposed on random events, they serve an important psychological function. And who's to say meaning can't be real even if it's constructed? We construct meaning throughout life. Why should death be different? Some people seek more direct contact through mediums, individuals who claim to communicate with the dead. This is deeply controversial territory, rife with fraud and exploitation. Cold reading techniques, where a skilled performer makes general statements and watches for reactions, can create convincing illusions of contact. Preying on grieving people's vulnerability is unconscionable and sadly common. And yet, there are cases that perplex even skeptical investigators. Mediums who provide specific, verifiable information they couldn't have known through normal means. Names, dates, private details about relationships, even physical descriptions of obscure objects with sentimental value. Are these anomalies explained by lucky guesses, subtle cues picked up unconsciously, or prior research by the medium? Often, yes. But the handful of truly unexplained cases lingers in the background, refusing to be entirely dismissed. The University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, a legitimate academic research centre, has investigated mediumship under controlled conditions. Their findings are cautious but intriguing. Some mediums perform significantly better than chance at providing accurate information, even when all normal channels of information are blocked. It doesn't prove they're communicating with the dead. Other explanations involving telepathy or precognition are possible, but it suggests something anomalous is occurring. Here's a thought that brings some comfort. If consciousness does continue in any form after death, your loved ones would presumably still care about you. The relationships that defined your shared lives wouldn't simply evaporate. They might not be able to interact with you in obvious physical ways. There are limits to what consciousness without a body could do in a material world, but perhaps they remain aware of you, concerned for you, connected to you across whatever boundary separates the living and the dead. Many spiritual traditions describe the dead as more aware than the living, capable of perceiving us clearly even though we can't perceive them. From their perspective, they haven't left you. You simply can't see them anymore. Like being separated by a one-way mirror, they see you perfectly while you see only your reflection. Is this comforting or disturbing? Perhaps both. The idea of being watched by deceased relatives could feel intrusive, but most people find comfort in the thought that their loved ones might still be present, still aware, still caring. That death severs physical presence but not emotional connection. There's also the question of reunion. Will you see them again? If consciousness persists and if memory survives death, then presumably you'd recognize each other after you die. The relationships that shaped your life would resume in whatever form is possible in that state. That grandmother who always made you feel loved, that friend who understood you completely, their essence, if it continues, would still contain the patterns that made them who they were. Many NDE accounts include reunions with deceased loved ones, suggesting that if there's an afterlife, we don't face it alone. We're met by familiar faces, welcomed by those who travelled before us. Whether this reflects actual metaphysical reality or is the dying brain's final comfort doesn't diminish its power. Even if it's a hallucination, it's a remarkably kind one. Here's something worth pondering. The atoms in your body were once part of other bodies, other living things, cycling through the ecosystem across billions of years. The carbon in your hand might have been in a dinosaur once, in trees and fish, and countless humans throughout history. Matter is constantly recycled, reassembled into new forms. Nothing is ever truly lost, just transformed. If that's true for matter and energy, why not for information and pattern? Perhaps consciousness doesn't disappear but transforms, becomes part of something larger while retaining its essential structure. Your loved ones might not be gone but changed, existing in a form you can't yet perceive but no less real for that. They were patterns of matter and energy and information, and those patterns persist somewhere, somehow in ways physics hasn't yet discovered how to measure. This is speculation, of course, hope dressed up in quasi-scientific language, but it's not unreasonable speculation. The universe is stranger than we know. Consciousness is real and profoundly mysterious. Death is the greatest unknown. Within that space of uncertainty, the possibility that love and connection persist beyond death isn't disproven, just unproven. And maybe that's enough. Maybe not knowing for certain makes the relationships we have now more precious. We act as though we have forever, but we don't. The time we have with people is finite, bounded by death's inevitable arrival. Perhaps that finitude is what makes love meaningful, what gives relationships their depth and poignancy. But the hope that death isn't quite the end, that the people we love remain somehow accessible, connected to us across whatever veil separates the living and dead, that hope is human and universal, and perhaps more than wishful thinking. Perhaps it's an intuition about something real, something consciousness knows even when the rational mind doubts. Your loved ones who've passed, wherever they are, whatever they've become, whether they exist as individual consciousnesses or have merged into something larger, whether they perceive you clearly or vaguely or not at all, they were real. They loved you. That love existed, tangible and meaningful, as real as anything in this universe. And love, whatever else it is a pattern of connection, of caring, of recognition between consciousnesses. Patterns persist, information endures, nothing in the universe is truly destroyed, just transformed. And if that's true for energy and matter, perhaps it's true for love as well. Perhaps the bonds between people transcend physical separation, even the ultimate separation of death. Perhaps your grandmother, your friend, your parent, whoever you've lost, perhaps they're not as far away as death makes it seem. We can't prove it, we can't measure it, but we can hope it's true. And hope, in the face of death and grief and loss, is its own form of courage, its own kind of faith in the universe's fundamental benevolence. Right then, that's about as far as we can venture into these mysteries without losing ourselves entirely in speculation. We've covered the science, examined the strange experiences, wrestled with consciousness, and explored the possibilities. Time to bring this all together, I think. And so we find ourselves at the end of our journey through one of humanity's most profound mysteries, from the biological cascade of death through the puzzling realm of near-death experiences, from the hard problem of consciousness to speculation about souls and spirits and reunions with the dead. It's been quite the expedition into uncertainty, hasn't it? For me, the question of an afterlife is deeply personal. Having lost both my mother and my brother, I've found a quiet comfort in a more spiritual belief that they are, in some way, still around. It's a feeling that has brought me a great deal of peace through difficult times. And yet, I have the deepest respect for those who are skeptical. Science is built on evidence, and it is perfectly understandable and right to hold that view. There is absolutely no single right or wrong answer here, just our own individual paths and perspectives. I find it fascinating that science, in all its brilliance, hasn't yet found the definitive answers, and I hold on to the hope that someday it might. But for now, I choose to believe my loved ones are still near. I would be truly honoured to hear your own thoughts on this, whatever they may be. There is no judgment here, only curiosity and community. Please feel free to share your perspective in the comments below, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between. It would just be nice to hear what you're thinking. Anyway, if you're still awake, and honestly, falling asleep would have been perfectly acceptable about 3 chapters ago, I hope you found something here worth contemplating. Not answers, exactly, because I can't offer those. Nobody can, not really. But perhaps some new ways of thinking about death, some comfort in the face of our greatest unknown. But for now, you're here, alive, conscious, listening to someone ramble about death and afterlife while you drift towards sleep. Your brain is functioning, creating your experience of reality moment by moment. Your body is breathing, heart beating, maintaining the biological systems that support your consciousness. However it all works, whether you're a temporarily animated collection of matter or an eternal spirit having a physical experience, right now you exist, and that's rather wonderful. I want to thank you for spending this time contemplating these mysteries with me. I hope it's given you some peace, some new perspectives, maybe even some comfort. Death is frightening because it's unknown, but the unknown isn't necessarily terrible. It might be strange or beautiful or nothing at all, but whatever it is, you'll meet it when the time comes. Until then, love the people around you. Notice beauty, ask questions, wonder about the mystery of consciousness and existence. Be kind, make mistakes, learn things, experience everything you can. Because whether this is all there is or just one chapter in a longer story, it matters. You matter. Your life, your relationships, your consciousness experiencing the universe, all of it matters. If you're still awake, I admire your stamina, but it's time to properly let go now. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the weight of your body against the bed. Notice your breath, slow and steady. Let your mind drift where it will, toward sleep, toward dreams, toward whatever comes next in the small deaths and rebirths of nightly rest. And if you've already fallen asleep, well, that's what I was hoping for. I also hope you have peaceful dreams, free from fear about death or endings or loss. May you wake refreshed, ready to live another day of this strange, precious, temporary existence we're all sharing. I'm going to let some relaxing ambient sounds play out as usual, in case you want to use them to sleep. Until next time, good night.